Hello, I'm George Middleton, your host this evening on this podcast episode of Black Space Live. We're going to continue part 2 of the topic of our discussion today. Critical race theory, what it is and what it is not. But before we get started, I'd like to take this time briefly to encourage you to like, subscribe, and share this podcast. In other words, don't be selfish with this content. Share the love. And also, before I bring back my esteemed guests, I'd like to do a little shameless plug. I just finished my first children's book titled Kids Are Not Crayons. And it's a book on healthy self-identity and healthy self-esteem. It's available on Amazon. It's got great illustrations and it has a great message if you want to improve the way your children perceive themselves and others and how their identities are formed and how they can build a healthier self-esteem. So with that being said, I am so happy to come back to have the great Dr. William Muldrow. Now I call him doctor. I don't care if he isn't one or not, but this man impressed me so much last week. He just blew my mind last week that in my mind, this cat is a doctor. Dr. Mojo. Mojo, welcome back, brother.
It's good to be back.
Yes, and I think that we left some meat on the bone with this topic, and this is part 2. And so for any of you viewers who are catching this part 2, we highly recommend that you go back and watch part 1 because we're taking you point by point through the actual objective facts on what critical race theory is and is not. And so today we're going to move it further now that we've established the difference between, well, actually, we left some homework for everybody. And the homework is, as you'll see in my made up slide here, what is the difference between critical race theory and race ideology? Any of you viewers from last week, you were assigned to meditate on that question based on the information that we presented to you to see if you're picking up what we're putting down. Again, what is the difference between critical race theory and race ideology? And so for part 2, we're going to get into that in more detail, and then we're going to look at how it's being applied or not being applied in regard to the behaviors such as the nationwide school board protests by parents who feel their white children are being harmed by the truth of our history. So, Dr. Mojo, welcome back. And I like to say for the show, the theme for the show is when we have you on, I got my mojo working. How you feeling today, man?
All right, I feel all right.
You know, we had an interesting commentary on our YouTube comment section. Before we get into it, you want to kind of speak on the type of interaction we had with this particular commentator last week. Any words of wisdom that you want to drop?
Well, I mean, it was typical. He was triggered and he wanted to, establish something that, to me, I mean, I understand, white people feeling like that they are being blamed for things they have nothing to do with, and that's fine. But also, if you're going to you have to take the good with the bad. So if you're going to say, well, I had nothing to do with slavery, one thing, I wasn't talking about slavery. And then and what he said is all too common. He kept talking about the innocent generations, and this is blaming the innocent. There are no innocent generations. Let's just get that clear.
Whoa.
Okay?
Wow.
Because what he wants to say is that's why they want to bring up slavery, because that was over a century ago. Well, I was alive during Jim Crow, because it didn't end in 1968. I was born in 1973. I saw plenty of places in the South that were still all white. So yeah, what about that? I mean, black people paid taxes for public works that they didn't have access to for 70 years. What about that?
What about that?
I mean, and because this concept of you being innocent because you didn't own slaves. Well, let's look at that. How innocent are you? If your grandparents robbed a bank, they were never arrested. They kept the money. They bought a house. Your family lives in the house on that stolen money. Are you innocent? You might not have robbed the bank, but if you inherited money that was stolen, yeah, you're guilty. You can't be as innocent when you benefit from the crime. So and for that to happen, for this innocence, that's like another ridiculous thing is reverse racism. You can't have something go in reverse until something stops. Like you can't drive your car backwards until you bring your car to a stop. Then you can go in the reverse. You cannot go forward and reverse it the same way. So first we have to establish, when did racism stop?
When did it stop?
Before you can say there's reverse racism. You cannot have forward racism and reverse racism at the same time. So when he can tell me when racism stopped, when America took accountability for it, and when any of these things that were created, like so many of the laws and the policies, and that's what critical race theory examines. Well, if they were created by a racist and they're still being used without any change, well, then racism was sewn into the woodwork. Just because you didn't write the law, well, if your grandpappy wrote it and he was a racist and he wrote it and he put his racism into all these things that still exist, all these organizations that still exist, all these institutions that still exist, all these laws, all these policies that still exist, well, then racism is on autopilot and you're benefiting from it and I'm suffering from it. So you're not innocent.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you just got your first physics lesson in racism. You can't have forward racism and reverse racism at the same time. It's got to be one or the other. That's a t-shirt, brother. That's a t-shirt. And when you and that also brings up the matter of reparations, because similarly, reparations implies past transgressions. So if you are going to admit that reparations are owed to the African American community, descendants of slavery, for the economic and physical exploitation, then also that means that the behavior that you're paying reparations for has ceased. Why continue to pay reparations on something that you're still damaging? So again, racism unless you can show us the date that racism has officially and effectively ended, then that reparations number is mounting daily.
And hence that's where the opposition for critical race theory, when it's not in secondary school, it's never been taught in secondary school. It is barely taught in grad school courses, and only in public administration and law. But it's about critical race theory is about analyzing the effects of racism, and if you're denying that racism exists, you have to be opposed to something that systematically analyzes something you say that is imaginary, and it analyzes history and the racist components and opponents of history, of historic events. Well, if you're in the process of full denial, and that's what America is about, it's about denying these things have occurred, And critical race theory and even history itself makes denying it difficult. So either you got to skip over that history, revise that history, and by all means, don't analyze it.
So that leads us right into the next slide, which is answering the question of the homework that was assigned last week: the difference between critical race theory and race ideology. So on this particular side, and my apologies to the watchers, excuse me, because this is not a very clear screen presentation. And excuse me, something just went down my throat. Okay, let's see if that'll clear that up. In last week's presentation, we delineated the difference between the ideology and the theory. The ideology is race, and and to put it, paraphrase the definition, it's an ideology created by the European in the 1600s for the purpose of justification of the transatlantic slave trade. And that's where the European created racial classifications, white and black. White was the standard. Excuse me. White was the standard, and black was considered inferiority, and people of darker skin were to be perceived as low of intellectual value, incompetent, slow development. Now, critical race theory is the study of the impact of the ideology. Now, that's how I would delineate the difference. Dr. Mojo, put your piece in there just to make sure that I've covered all of the aspects of that.
Well, I mean, critical race theory it's a methodology. It's just giving you a framework in which to analyze how race has found its way into laws and public policy primarily, and then how they have affect things in the present. It's not black history, it's not history at all. It's purely a methodology. In fact, if you look at how it's structured, what they did is occurred to me last week, because I said I have a background in computer science, which is almost the entire base is logic. I mean, we can interchange different computer languages, but without logic, you can't. You're just completely lost. Mm-hmm. And in mathematics and science, they both take from logic in the sense of the process of performing proofs. And if you look at how critical race theory, how the tenets are set up, it's set up exactly like doing a mathematic or a scientific proof. You have something that's given. You cannot begin a proof without saying, well, this part is given, accept that. If you don't accept that, you can't go to the next step. Then you either use deductive or inductive reasoning, whatever methods to show that this is the only outcome. And then if you can accomplish that, which you might never accomplish that, then you get to the end and you have 3 dots for therefore. That's what I want to show. What I assumed. You have your assertion, you have your given, and then you go through the steps of analyzing it, and then you have the outcome. And that's what it is. It's just trying to apply objective reasoning to something that has been treated as subjective data instead of actual historic facts. The law is not subjective. The law is, but yes. But when you talk about what its intentions are, then you get into subjective, and then critical race theory say, okay, let's get away from this subjective when we can look at who wrote the law, what their intentions were, what was the discussion on the floor when the bill came up, and look at these things and show proof that yes, racism was part of it. It might not have been the entire thing, and often some of these things that they analyze through the process of critical race theory in the 70s and the 80s, it didn't say that this was outright racist, that this was completely blatant. And most things are not going to be, at least not things that persisted, because you kind of have to hide it. The devil is in the details. There's very few things that were just blatantly racist, but it's showing, identifying the racist components of these laws and these policies. And then you have to look at the impact of it.
Now, what I find interesting in doing this work is that in one of my earlier writings, it's a workbook that I published titled Beliefs Limiting Authentic Cultural Knowledge. And it's the acronym for BLACK. And before the first chapter, there's a quote I wrote in there that goes like this: beliefs are more powerful than facts. And I think it's very relevant in this particular discussion. Last week, we really laid out a very objective, factual-based line of rationale and description and explanation on what critical race theory is and what it is not. And after that, we had some really interesting comments. And so let me read the comment from last week that you really kind of spoke to just now in your description. After we laid out the facts, this person states the following: CRT promotes the notion that the fact that a group is measurably superior. I mean, listen to that right off. He's already off the trail. Promotes the notion that the fact that a group is measurably superior is proof in that everybody in that group is guilty. Wow. And that a group being inferior is proof that everybody in that group is a victim. Further, this principle projects through time, asserting that what happened to the long dead projects what happened to the long dead projects onto the guilt or victimhood of the living, even if the living never experienced it at all. So he just covered he really responded exactly as you just described, in terms of from that white identity, feeling like, it's a blame towards him. But I tell you, that first line just says it all. I'm going to read it again. CRT promotes the notion that the fact that a group is measurably superior is proof that everybody in that group is guilty. Wow. What a powerful misinterpretation and misunderstanding of this line. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I always find it, personally amusing to me that somebody can clearly demonstrate their mental inferiority and think they're superior in the course of doing it. Wow. When you are incapable, you are wholly incapable of comprehending something that was laid out for you in a manner that the most remedial child could understand, and you were incapable of understanding it, yet you feel like you're superior. But I the same feeling I used to get looking at people that did not get out of the 8th grade, were going around the country talking about how ignorant and stupid Barack Obama, a noted scholar, the head of the law review at Harvard, a constitutional law professor, he is ignorant, and you, a middle school dropout, are smarter than this man. So, I mean, racist, it doesn't have logic, and racism do not agree with each other.
And you're familiar with the quote attributed to President Lyndon Johnson, right?
Oh yeah, if you can convince the poorest white man that he's better than the richest black man, then you won't have to rob him. He'll pick his own
empty his pockets for you.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Actually, it's a couple of people attributed with that quote. It's changed a little bit around, but it's still poignant.
It's very poignant. Yes, well said. Okay, so I'm going to read again the official objective term of critical race theory, because clearly this cannot be repeated enough to overcome many people's belief systems. Sometimes, repetition is a very strong and effective tool. And we learned that from the previous presidential administration. Repetition is a great tool. It can be used for good, and it can be used for chaos, behavior, manipulative purposes as well. So repetition can be used to empower, and can also be used to victimize others. So I'm going to repeat this again to empower the listeners. Critical race theory, a theoretical framework in the social sciences focused upon the application of critical theory, a critical examination of society and culture to the intersection of race, law, and power. Now, and I'd love for you to speak on this, Dr. Mojo. Critical theory. A lot of the detractors try to loop in its Marxist originations as if somehow critical race theory is a communist-driven socialist. And when I say these, I don't see communism or socialism as a good or bad thing. It's just an is thing. Everybody has different philosophies of government. But the detractors tend to lump in critical race theory with the alleged Marxist origins of critical theory. Can you speak on that?
Because they aren't imaginative enough to come up with new tactics. They did the exact same thing in the 50s and the 60s. If you look at the first thing that as soon as you went to your first march, as soon as you made the paper and you were a civil rights leader, a black activist, you became a communist, and you got on that list. You got on Senator McCarthy's list of communists. They had, if you look at that list, it was professors, it was teachers, it was black activists, it was women's rights feminists. They never spoke anything about any political systems. All they spoke about was equal rights for women, equal rights for minorities, free speech, free expanding education. This is what their platform. They were labeled as communists. And once you were on that list, you went through the entire McCarthy era. Well, it's, instead of communists, now they just label everything as socialist, and they do it so effectively because the people it upsets have no idea what socialism is. They haven't the slightest clue what socialism is. Somebody told them it was bad, and then somebody called someone else a socialist. So by the transitive property of bad, he's bad. He's a bad socialist. I mean, socialism is an economic an economic design. So if you're not talking about economics, if you're not talking about the government controlling all of the forms and tools of manufacturing instead of the private sector, that's socialism. So unless you're specifically talking about the government owns all the companies, all the corporations, all the production means, then you're not talking about socialism. So everything else you're talking about is not socialism, because that's what socialism is. So I mean, it's ridiculous because there's nothing in critical race theory that talks about economics. Unless you talk about and like I said, analyze things. Yeah, they analyze redlining if that's what you want to talk about. But yeah, it has nothing to do with each other whatsoever. So they heard Karl Marx was a bad dude, so so somebody said, these people are Marxists. I mean, and in all actuality, Karl Marx, he just analyzed a bunch. He was equally as critical of what they call Marxism as he was every other system, because he said that these are all philosophies. They might be based on finance and economics, but they're philosophies, and all philosophies, when implemented in a pure form, will collapse. They're extremism, and they cannot be implemented in a realistic world. They'll just collapse in a different manner. He said capitalism will collapse, communism, socialism will collapse. So, but they don't.
And it's so relevant to today because aren't we right now facing that possibility under the weight of our own ignorance? And the undercurrent of this behavior today is this racial ignorance, this ignorance of what race is, and the belief in the great replacement theory. These things are driving our country to that exact prediction of Karl Marx. What do you think?
Well, I mean, the problem is that people they just, when they live their lives and they go through everyday thing without needing to or having to understand the systems that they advocated their whole life. See, I mean, they're sitting here yelling about socialism and welfare and then saying how patriotic you are. Did you ever read the preamble of the Constitution? So we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. Do you realize that this is a democratic socialism model government? It always has been since the Constitution was signed. So
yeah, you don't really hear too much about rugged individualism in that theme, do you?
No, and yet, well, the fact of what do they think their taxes are paying for? I mean, that's the social contract. The social contract is you give up some of your freedoms for the programs that the government takes your taxes, and then they provide public works and public goods with your taxes. That's what they're supposed to do. That's why you pay your taxes. And then they're going to tell you it's socialism if you get anything out of your taxes. That's what they're supposed to be doing. Wow. You're supposed to get a benefit from your taxes. You're not supposed to just be paying taxes so billionaires and corporations can have more money. And I mean, and they convinced these poor people to advocate for all the wealthy people. It's just amazing.
Yes. Yes. That's that Lyndon Johnson quote all over again in repetition.
I mean, and what the part that amazes me as far as it comes to races, their grandparents would despise them. Their grandparents, they think their grandparents were happy working in the fields and working in these factories for these and children. I mean, we had like 30% of the factory workforce at one point was children, because you had to have a four income family just to feed people before Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. And now we're fighting for things that these battles have already been fought for, labor unions and things like that. And yeah, your grandparents fought for that stuff, and now you talking about you don't want it. I'm about pulling yourself up by a bootstrap. Their grandparents might have been more racist, but they did not like rich people. I mean, even in the 80s, the bad guy in every movie was the rich guy. The rich guy and the Russian. I mean, I grew up in the Cold War. There was two things we did not like. We didn't like until Reagan changed that. But up until Reagan, if a real American did not like rich people and did not like Russians. And now look at where we at now. They idolizing billionaires and talking about how manly Putin is. Man, their grandparents would tear them up.
Turn over, man. Turn over. Well said, brother. Well said. So in the next slide in my presentation, we examine a question. And the question is, why are parents and schools debating if critical race theory should be included in the curriculum? Now, during my presentation with companies, I allow them to kind of expound on that question before I give them my clinical assessment of it. So, I'll do away with that part of it and just go right to my clinical perspective. The contributing factors to this behavior are, one, that these protesters, these detractors of critical race theory, are reacting from a racial identity, either black or white. And in so doing, it makes them vulnerable to political manipulation. because after all, race is a political concept. Political ideology has also been conflated with race ideology. And lastly, and most importantly, the whole or majority of America is significantly uneducated about race ideology. So it's just they're all of four different points to kind of say the same thing. It's just a deep-seated ignorance and conflation of the concept of race, critical race theory, and politics. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, the biggest problem is people can't think rationally about things that they become too emotional about. And then when people, so people start to feel accused and on one side, and then they don't want to, they'd rather go into denial. And then on the other side, you have people that have been fighting so long just to have the basic human rights, and then they're being ignored, and then they become emotional, and so you have a complete disconnect where there is no progress. And I mean, Malcolm X had an analogy, and it's sad that after all these years, he's been dead 40 over 40 years, and his analogy still holds. He said that racism was like a knife in someone's back, and if you have a knife that's in your back 9 inches, and then someone pulls the knife out 4 inches, that's not progress. They said that's what America wants to say. They pull the knife out a little bit, and they said that, well, that's not progress. So you have to remove the knife for healing to begin, for progress to be made. And the problem is, I'd go further than that. Not only is America not willing to pull the knife out, they're not willing to admit the knife was ever in there.
Even in there.
And so things like critical race, it doesn't matter. The thing that's upsetting them is the mentioning of race, period. See, because they don't understand critical race theory, but you could put that word race and it's inflammatory, and then they're against it.
Yeah, because it's that word race, right, strikes at the emotion. You're right, and that's a very valid assessment. Is because of the emotionalization of the issue, it is almost next to impossible to think in rational terms. To think objectively about a situation. Only a small percentage of human beings have that ability to truly encapsulate what objectivity is about, because objectivity is a great tool. It's great for your own personal edification, and if you're a leader, it's an awesome tool as a leader to be effective. and the emotion that you do use, because you have the ability of objectivity, now becomes more effective because you're objectively harnessing your emotion toward the greater good of whatever group that you are leading, promoting, or representing. So then the next slide gets into identity, because that's where the seat of our emotion lies, is within our identity. So at this point in my presentation, I asked a question. There's no right or no wrong answer. It's just how people that are in the presentation actually think. And I love asking this question because it gets just different responses. And the question being, are you your color, or are you your culture? Screen's in the way. Are you your color, or are you your culture? And when I ask this question, it really makes people think. It just makes them think for a minute, because for the average person, color and culture are the same. And my goal with this question is to get you to at least understand that there is a difference between race and culture. So, Dr. Mojo, how does this question hit you? How would you reword it? And you may even have a more entertaining combination of words to address it.
Well, I mean, culture is something that constantly evolves. I mean, the most basic definition of culture is anything that we make, do, or create to improve or enhance our survival and well-being. That's what it's the artifacts of civilization. Everything that we made with music, tools, food, everything. Those are all parts of culture. So you don't you don't identify with culture. Culture is an active thing. You participate in culture. You don't identify as culture.
Hmm.
So it's to me one is a noun and the other one is a verb.
I love that. I've never looked at it that way. The culture is that you participate in it. It does require. It's more of an action word than it is a noun. Hmm.
And also like I said, there's definitely more subsects of culture than there are of race, because
Right.
just
Correct.
within the black experience, then
Right.
you have all types of different islands, and have all the different diaspora of African
Yes.
countries.
Yes.
Ethiopia, Senegal. Then you have Jamaica, Trinidad. You have all these very very defined cultures, and they all could be considered black culture, unless you're not one of them. I can't, if I went and claimed Haitian culture, and I've never even visited Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
Haitians be mad.
Mm-hmm. You're
I can't
right.
just say I'm black and claim Haitian culture.
No, don't work that way. So then, after the participants, mull over the question and then kind of seep into their awareness that there is a difference between color and culture, I use this next activity uh, where we name, because it gets into the definition of culture that you stated, and there's one other very relevant pattern within uh, cultural concepts. They're generally associated with a geographical location. So, if a person is of German culture, you know what the geographical location is of that. If a person is of Asian culture, you understand geographically where that resides. If a person's of Hispanic culture or American culture, and so on. When I get onto the color side of the identity, I then say, what geographical location is black from? What geographical location is white from? And what'll happen 9 times out of 10 is they'll respond with cultural names for the color identity. And then I point out, well, if black is truly a culture, shouldn't its geographical location be very similar in name as these cultural designations over here? For example, black land or white land. Very basic concepts, right? But it really shakes people's cognitive processes up when I take him through this a very basic activity. What are your thoughts on this, Dr. Mojo?
Well, it's it's a helpful tool for people to unlearn things that they didn't spend any significant amount of time thinking about. And that's one of the problems is sometimes we just take things for granted, and we didn't even realize how we thought about something until someone calls us upon it, or questions, and or we do these exercises. And if you don't even know how you think about something, how can you oppose it? And so we come back again to tools to analyze things.
Right.
Because without analysis, there's no understanding. Without understanding, there's no identification. Without identification, there's no change.
Say that again.
Without analysis, there is no understanding. Without understanding, there's no identification. Without identification, there's no change.
Love it.
I mean, you have to know what the problem is before you can treat it.
That's it. It's very, I mean, that's the process I use as a therapist. That's exact chain of events. So, you know, anytime I'm going to work with a client, I just can't come in starting to make change on this client and haven't got a full understanding and analysis and an ability to identify the situation before I can make change. So then after we go through that, I'll ask another very basic question. The question is, since race is a social construct, what does that logically say for racial identity? Now, I get a couple of different responses, you know, especially when people are being introduced to the notion that they thought they've been black their whole life, or they thought they've been white their whole life. And now here is crazy George Middleton with his racial deconstruction program telling them that that's not a valid identity. And the mind does amazing things to try to make an untruth be a truth. And for the black identity, there's such a, because that identity is associated with all of the historical traumas, struggles, historical and current, that the whole identity of the average Black identity mindset is it wrapped around struggle and resilience and the ability to take a punch and still be here. I'm still here. And one day we shall overcome. The white identity, their response typically, not always, but typically is one of they're finding any reason to support maintaining the status quo of whiteness. Things like, well, if you take this away, then Black people won't know that they're in danger. If you can't take white away because it's in our system, it's tradition. I mean, they'll just find a number of ways. Or, you know, just because I'm white doesn't. This is the most dangerous one. This is the one that really fools people who identify either way. Just because I'm white doesn't mean that I'm racist.
You know, I wish that people had enough understanding. If people actually really understood what race was, then you could move. Because yeah, I guess I would be offended too if I had that limited understanding about race and racism. But instead of saying, well, just because I'm white doesn't mean I'm racist, and just because I'm racist doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a bad person. Because
right. Oh, yes.
Because see, you can be a racist and be one of the best people in the world, and people when I say that, people do not understand it, and they
That's
don't.
Right.
But if you are a participant and you are actively benefiting from the institution of racism, you don't hate anybody, you don't dislike anyone, you might not even have these thoughts of superior and inferior, but you inherited all of these benefits of the system and you're perpetuating it. And if that same system is harming other people, you're turning a blind eye to it. You're not doing anything actively to harm someone yourself, but you're helping the machine that does. You're a racist. You're not a bad person necessarily. You're not a hero, but you can be a racist and not be a bad person, because people confuse hatred and racism. They're not the same thing.
Well said.
I mean, you can. Like I did ask a classroom in college. I think it was a humanities class once. And we were having this discussion. I asked everybody. Said everybody that has pets in the class. I think it was probably about 40 people in the classroom. Raise your hand. About 35, 36 people raised their hand. Said everybody that loves their pets. I mean, truly loves them like they're a member of the family. Keep your hands raised. Not many hands went down. You know, out of 40 people, probably still 28 hands up. All these people, I said, all these people love your pet like their family. I said, yeah. Keep your hands up if you think that your pet should have rights. And they kind of giggled and let me make it look. Put your should be able to dinner table eat, and just like you. If you think your pet should be able to own property. Your pet should be able to vote. And you know, almost all the hands went down. They laughing. And I was like, "But you love your pet. You don't hate them, do you?" I said, "No." I said, "Well, why shouldn't they have rights?" And because there's a dog, so you're superior. You love it, but you're superior. And since you're superior, that's why they shouldn't have rights. I said, that's racism. That's racism with love.
You know, nothing.
You are superior. That's why you do not believe that your pet should have rights. That's why you think that you should have something that they shouldn't have. But you sincerely love them. You just feel you're better than them and they shouldn't have rights because you're better than them. That's how you can be a racist and not hate someone. If you think that you're better and you feel like there's a reason, there's a rationale, because rationale and hatred aren't the same thing.
That's right.
Hatred is emotional. Rationale is logical, even if it's flawed. Logic is still a form of logic.
Exactly. And that made to the average person seem like a really irrelevant analogy. I mean, it frames, you know, typically analogies aren't true to life. They're just used to make comparisons. But the analogy you just used actually was used, that type of thought was used toward us, our ancestors. We were considered assets.
And still are, because, you know, if you hear the most racist thing that you ever hear someone slip up and say is not the N-word. It's when they compare black people to beasts, to animals, to monkeys, to savages. I mean, because, you know, N-word, yeah, that's a word that it needs context to have power.
Yes.
It might not have any impact at all. But if you call someone a beast, call someone a monkey, no, that has a lot of connotation. People don't understand the difference between the connotation of a word and the denotation of a word. The denotation is what the word literally means. If someone called me a monkey, they do not literally think that I'm a monkey. The connotation is the figurative meaning and the underlining meanings of a word. And so when they use these words, they're definitely not using the literal meaning. They're using the racist meaning, the underlying meaning, the connotation.
Well, yeah, great difference, and that's how effective. That's how that it uses that connotative effect very effectively, very strategically. Because it has that impact where a person can intentionally do something racist and not call it racist, and therefore it really can't be proven.
Well, and that's the thing. That's one of the excuses, because people will do something that is racist, and since they don't really have hatred or direct malice in their hearts or minds when they do it, they literally think that that action wasn't racist because they think that hatred is the qualifier.
Exactly. This brings to mind the most recent incident from what is not Sesame Street, but Sesame something.
Sesame Place.
Sesame Place.
Sesame Place in North Carolina. Yeah.
What is your take on it? Because I think this is really relevant to what we're speaking here with the denotative and connotative perspective on what happened with that character and those two children. What's your take on that?
Well, I guess I didn't have a lot of time to even have a doubt about it. I mean, my immediate thing is I was like, they intentionally walked past that child and looked at it and gestured so the child would know that they were being ignored. And while people were debating, and unfortunately, Sesame Place gave an apology and said it wasn't intentional. Good brother, well-known civil rights attorney Ben Crump, he posted a montage of dozens of incidents of mascots and costume characters ignoring, belittling, taunting, even pushed over a black child, and it was often that same character. So whoever's in that costume, they definitely have a problem, because there was like 5 or 6 on different days with different black children, and then there was some other characters mixed in there too. And this is over the course of a few years. So, because see, once that was the spark that lit it off, and so a lot of parents they didn't want to cause a scene with their children around, and so they just had this in their archive as this this little stone in their heart. And then somebody's stone hit the water and the ripple started, and then they say, you know what, well, look at this, look at this, and then the whole thing snowballed, and that gave it all context. And so it's easy to deny one incident one time. It's a lot harder to deny 30, and it's always a black child over the course of time. Now you have something where you can say, okay, now deny it. And Sesame Place retracted that apology, and they haven't given another one that I know yet, but they say they're going to look into it. Well, you should look into it before you said anything.
So right there, I think this example is a great demonstration of how critical race theory is used. You have the behavior of an ideology being potentially associated with the ideology, and that behavior being this particular Sesame character and what appeared to be a snub against 2 girls. So that instigated or inspired a retroactive exploration of any past incidents to see if there's a pattern. Now, again, is it incontrovertible proof? I don't know, but in law, there's this term called circumstantial.
Well, in law, all there's the weight of the preponderance.
Okay.
Preponderance of the evidence for a civil trial, like a lawsuit. The preponderance is a little more than maybe 51% is enough to get a verdict in your favor. It's more than likely. For criminal court is beyond a reasonable doubt. So it has to be a massive amount, but it's still, there's no certainty. So you never would get any type of verdict or ruling if you had to, empirically prove something for a fact. I mean, sometimes you can, but generally, no, you're making a decision based on the preponderance of the evidence. And that's just weighted on how likely something is against how unlikely it is. And so, at the beginning with that one incident, that one child, it was, it Could have been maybe. I mean, it
right.
could have been a bad day.
Just a bad
I
day.
mean,
Yeah.
you can see a person in there.
Right.
I mean, and so you know who was in there. It could have been a black person in there, and and that would have really thrown something in there. But that person could have been Clarence Thomas. So that don't prove nothing either.
Right. Right. And not every racial incident has the misfortune to leave behind a manifesto stating, "Hey, it was me."
Yeah. So I mean, there was, but the thing that struck about it is the arrogance, because if all these incidents had happened, then obviously they've been getting away with doing it for so long that they didn't think anything of it, and that's what when you talk about a culture of racism in an institution and in an organization. It's like if they say, well, no, the police have a couple of bad apples. No, actually, if you had a bad apple, the brass and the leadership catch it. And when these officers have a long history of complaints, and they were not punished. Often they were rewarded. So that's not a single officer. That's the entire culture of that police department. Exactly. So if that was accepted over all this time, there's a culture of racism going on at that park. It's bigger than an incident now. If it's been going on all this time and no one is disciplined, and people have gotten so arrogant about it, they don't think anything else. They've gotten like Trump. They go down Fifth Avenue, shoot somebody. They won't nobody do nothing.
And keep in mind, everything you're saying, these are theoretical approaches to a real life situation that happened with Sesame Place. We're trying to analyze behavior first began a single behavior, which grew into a pattern of behavior. Now we're trying to analyze the source of that behavior, if there's any ideology behind it, if this is intentional. These are all theoretical strategies being applied here.
Well, see, and then you get to why it's not by any accident that the three primary creators and founders of critical race theory were all lawyers. The hardest thing, I come from one of the most litigious families in the country. We sued everybody and beat them. I mean, I'm dead serious. I mean, three governors of Florida.
Wow.
Endless corporations. My father has more case precedents set than the majority of law firms combined. And so and the thing is, people don't understand when they talk about all these rights you have, that's a lie, because it is very expensive and it's very difficult to prosecute something in federal court. So all these civil rights laws, all that stuff, that's something that has to be in a federal court. And it's difficult to prove, but there's also, just to file, it's thousands of dollars just to file. So these laws that were put in to protect poor people can't afford them. And so basically, that was a little sleight of hand. You passed some civil rights law, and you make it impossible to get access to the courts to implement them or to use them. So you really did nothing. But it's so difficult because you have to even be able to file, to have stake in federal court. But if you're going to say something was discrimination, was racial discrimination, whatever, you have to prove complicity. You have to prove conspiracy. You can't just say, well, I feel like this is racist. That's not how it works. There's a bar that is set that you have to prove, have a certain amount of proof and compelling evidence just to file. So that's why critical race theory comes in. It's a method of examining these things and going back and looking, because that's what they'd have to do if they were going to prosecute a civil rights case. You can't just walk in there and say, well, I feel like they were racist to me. No, you have to have a monumental amount of compelling evidence to win a civil rights suit. And this is a methodology of looking at it. So, and that's why they use it with laws, and they use it with public policy. And in public policy, that's a whole different court. That's the court of administrative hearings, because public policy isn't law. So you have to either show how it contradicts the law, or you have to show where they didn't have the power to implement the policy. So, and there's no jury. There's just a judge, and that one actually knows the law. I like the court administrative hearings because it's about the only time you get a judge that actually knows the law, instead of some brat that somebody is stuck on a bench and never argued a trial in their life and completely and totally unqualified, like everybody that Trump appointed.
And the what you just said in terms of it being a tool, it reminded me of another assertion that this gentleman made in the a post last week, and he made the statement that I've spoken to CRT or critical race theorists as if it was a group or a club, and I told him that there is no group aligned to CRT. There is no club. It is not a political ideology.
But it's a club. It's a club that's going against it, because where this really started is the conservative think tank, if you want to call them a think tank. But it's the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation has spent millions of dollars, and they have a list. They have a list of all these things that were caused by critical race theory. Black Lives Matter protests are number one. So they were not called people actually by. It didn't come from. Let's see, the freedom, the freedom fighters and the students and the civil rights attorneys that started out in Sanford, Florida, after the Trayvon Martin incident and George Floyd, was years and years after that. But that's where grassroots started with Trayvon Martin. But somehow, no, it was critical race theory. What happened is we wasn't thinking about anything, and then we came across critical race theory. Then we got mad and made Black Lives Matter, and it just so happened that coincidentally the police were killing people. So we just put them two together and went out and had a march. That's so ridiculous. They also, this critical race theory is the reason why there are gay and lesbian clubs in grade schools. I'm not sure how, but these are the things the Heritage Foundation need, and this is who is pumping this propaganda.
Yes.
Get rid of it. So there's a group there. Yeah, there's a group against it.
Yes.
And everything they say is ridiculous, but yeah, nobody that'd be like saying there's a group of people that support proofs. So yeah, me and my friends in the logic classes, we get together and we just do proofs of stuff. It's a fun time for all.
and that assertion brings us to the last slide that I want to leave everybody with. That this is a politically manipulated concept, and this has a lot of relevance because it's gotten stronger. As much as we've been putting out the light on the darkness of the ignorance of this issue, it is not going away. It is getting stronger. It's growing in sunlight. It's growing in broad daylight, this ignorance. This slide I have here is a slide of President Obama and Trump. And Trump is the guy that really spearheaded this movement when he banned, believe it was an executive order, when he banned all diversity and inclusion training from federal employees. And his rationale pretty much was similar to what you hear the average detractor say, based on the fear of being offensive to a certain group of people. He wouldn't say the group, but he would say it's offensive to certain people. And so the federal government is going to have no parts of that, and banned it. And that was the fire starter that started this national mania on CRT, Would you assert that to be accurate, or do you see it starting somewhere else before then?
Well, I mean, I really don't ever recall hearing it since the 90s. So
Right,
trying to
exactly.
think when it first popped up recently, I really can't track it. But I was like,
Mm-hmm.
when they was like, we got to get it out of schools. I said, yes. When did you get it into schools? I
Right,
mean, the
right.
way public schools are set up in the United States of America, you wouldn't have time to teach the concept. I
No,
mean, teachers are they're trying to get their students to ready for standardized tests. They don't have time to
time for
actually
this.
teach the things they're supposed to teach in there, much less
No,
teaching critical race theory.
no, no. And then when you call a person who's in the system of education, well, not really. The people aren't in the system of education. It's these detractors like the Heritage Foundation and some of these other more local, regional groups that are taking up the work. They'll say things like, "Well, it's not really spelled out as critical race theory. It's integrated within the coursework."
Well, and you know what I see, I would love for one of them to debate me because I would destroy them in a minute because really I could use critical race theory to show what they're saying does happen, but it happened the other way with
Mm-hmm.
racism. If you studied the Civil War in the public school in the United States of America, you learned it a certain way, which is very flawed and romanticized. Like, for instance, you probably learned that the two opposing sides in the Civil War were the blue and the gray, the Yankees and the rebels. Now, let me put in here why I said that you got to go back. There was only two publishing houses, McCall and Prentice Hall, that were making over 80% of all the textbooks and history books in the United States of America. Yeah, they had an interesting benefactor every single year since like 1950, the Sons and Daughters of the Confederacy. They gave those publishing houses money every single year, and part of the deal was that they got to edit how the Civil War and how all of that content was taught. So think about that. The Sons and Daughters of the Confederacy have been manipulating how the Civil War and the South was portrayed in history books since 1950. And we can look at the check. We know that's for a fact. Now, so they hadn't have any problem with that because you know what I always thought was weird about how it's taught? The United States Army was founded in 1775. No, the rebels did not fight the Yankees. They fought the United States Army. The United States Army did not disband in the 1800s when the Civil War started. They were fighting the United States Army. But if you say the South fought the United States Army, that paints it in an entirely different light.
Total different. Never heard of
That's
never,
the absolute fact. They were fighting the United States Army.
It's never been put that way. Never heard it put that way. So, I think that this is important now because, and the question on the slide, this is for people's own self-reflection. Can you separate your racial thinking from your political decision making? And this may sound like a random question, but actually it's based on a body of research, a body of political research, because those professionals in a political realm, they already know the answer to this question. And the general body of research and practices says that the average person cannot separate their racial thinking from their political decision making. And many of our politicians count on that. They count on your ability not to be able to separate them because they know they can manipulate you towards a certain voting behavior based on your racial thinking. And so this is crucially important as we get ready to close this out, because the challenge, more important than understanding what CRT is and what CRT is not, is can you rise up to the challenge of really becoming a patriot, an American patriot, and separate out the ideology that actually detracts or hinders patriotism, that hinders what the true philosophy and vision of America is all about. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I reflect on something you said in the first show, where you were you reiterated again. You're saying that the theory of race was created, by white Europeans to perpetuate actually it's older than transatlantic slave trade, but it went into the British Empire before they even took slaves, and they were just taking land and occupying places. They already had that construct of race in there. And it strikes me that a lot of poor white people would be benefited by really understanding one thing. The concept of race and the ideology of racism was created to hurt poor white people too.
Exactly.
So they, instead of being upset with black people and thinking somebody's calling, they need to understand that 1% of the population, in order to stay rich and in order to keep their boot on your neck, they tell you that the weight on your neck is not a rich white man's boot, but a poor black man's ass. And they keep you, and they want so that they can keep all the minorities poor.
Yeah.
And even more white people poor.
And even more white people.
And infighting and not looking up. And as long as you looking at the other people on the ground with you, you're not looking up at who got their boot on your neck.
Exactly.
So white people, in that sense, white people have been victims of racism, but they have been victims of racism because they haven't figured out that if they ended racism, it would improve their lives. It would improve their access to things, because there's only so many resources. And what the game is about is the 1% wants to take 80% of the resources and get all of the colored folk and the poor white folk to fight over 20, instead of taking some of that 80 from them. I mean, they created, that's why racism doesn't make any sense outside of white supremacy, because they created the construct of race so they could identify the have and have-nots. They created racism to invent white supremacy. First, they invented race, then they invented white supremacy. So racism only refers to white supremacy. It doesn't refer to anything else, because outside of, if it wasn't for white supremacy, there would be no concept as race.
As you were thinking that, as you were talking, it caused me to think on your earlier example of reverse racism. And I wonder how the concept of critical reverse race theory would that be a more palatable concept to the white identity?
No, because they're triggered by certain words. I mean, just like that guy that commented, you can always tell because they use buzzwords that they heard on Fox and 4chan and stuff, like the victimhood. Right.
Yes.
They think if they tell black people that complaining about racism is a victim mentality. They're supposed to shame me into letting it go. No.
Yeah.
No. And and I'm not mad at your grandpa. I'm mad at you. So let's keep it in contemporary times, innocent man.
I ain't mad at your grandpa. I'm mad at you. I think that says it all right there. Well, man, we covered a lot. Mojo, you always deliver. And I think that part 1 and part 2, I highly recommend that these become resources for the listener. Save these 2 episodes and refer back to it. you're going to hear something different every time you speak. I've gotten since I got into this work and doing research, it's amazing how you can read something once and then put it down and come back to it and read it again, and it'll hit you in a totally different way, because your mind literally is not the same as when you first picked it up. And so for those who are listening now, those who tend to be detractors of critical race theory, give it some time. Give it some time. We've planted some seeds based on objective fact, no ideology-driven agendas here. And see if later when you come back that you don't hear some things that may strike you differently. But this has been a great show, a great episode. Dr. Mojo, you had it working.
Yeah, that's my dad. That's my dad. My dad is my father was one of the first black men to, if not the first black man to get his PhD in education from my alma mater, Florida State University. And so they always call him Doc. That's Dr. Muldrow. And actually, both of my sisters have gotten their PhDs too. I owe too much money to go back and get it.
Hey,
I wrote some people's dissertations for money.
Well, hey,
statute of limitations is gone on that, so you can't do nothing.
Well, I'll tell you what. Regardless, game recognized game, and your esteemed history and knowledge base, clearly talented. You're clearly a visionary. The way that you just can grab facts out of the air on call, just really impressive. And again, in this show, I learned a lot as well. So thanks for being panelists on our show. Thank you to you all, the listening audience, for being a part of this very informative podcast. So until then, have a great week. And until the next time we meet, we'll see you in the black space.
And we out.